When the wealthy arms dealer laughed at the quiet man sitting alone in the corner of the upscale military charity gala, he had no idea he was staring at one of the most dangerous operators who ever lived. Comment where you're watching from today, because this story will remind you that respect isn't about what someone wears, it's about what they've survived. The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers, each one worth more than most people's annual salary. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with aged whiskey filled the air as Washington's elite mingled in their designer suits and evening gowns. Politicians shook hands with defense contractors, while military officers in dress uniforms exchanged pleasantries with lobbyists. This was the annual Heroes Foundation Gala, where the powerful came to write checks and feel good about supporting veterans, though few had ever stepped foot on a battlefield themselves. In the far corner of the room, away from the clusters of networking elites, sat a man who looked distinctly out of place. Jason Statham wore a simple black suit, well-fitted but clearly not from a high-end boutique. His shoes were polished but showed signs of wear. While others sipped champagne from crystal flutes, he nursed a glass of water, his weathered hands steady as granite. His eyes, sharp and alert, occasionally swept the room with the practiced awareness of someone who had learned to assess threats in hostile territory. Most guests walked past without a second glance, assuming he was perhaps a low-level security contractor or maybe someone's assistant who'd been allowed to attend. What they didn't know was that Jason had been staring at a photograph for the past hour. A creased, worn image he kept in his wallet of himself and a German shepherd named Aria Hawkins. The photo was taken in Afghanistan, both of them covered in dust after a successful mission to clear an IED-laden compound. Aria's tongue hung out in a canine grin, while Jason's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. It was the last photo they'd taken together before the explosion that changed everything. 3 years ago, during what was supposed to be Jason's final deployment, their convoy had hit a roadside bomb outside Kandahar. Jason remembered the deafening blast, the world spinning upside down, and then waking up in a field hospital with shrapnel wounds and a concussion that left him dizzy for weeks. When he asked about Aria, the medics told him she hadn't made it. They said her body was recovered, that she died instantly. The guilt had eaten at him ever since. She had been his responsibility, his partner, and he had failed to protect her. Tonight's gala was being held in honor of military working dogs and their handlers. Jason had come hoping to find some peace, maybe connect with other handlers who understood the bond between soldier and dog. He donated what little he could afford to the cause and planned to slip out early, but something kept him in his seat. Perhaps it was the need to be around people who understood what Aria had meant to him, even if they didn't know his story. The evening's program had featured several speakers, including a retired general who spoke eloquently about the sacrifice of both two-legged and four-legged heroes. Videos played, showing current military dogs in training, their handlers beaming with pride as their partners demonstrated incredible skills. Jason watched each clip intently, remembering Aria's intelligence, her unwavering loyalty, and the way she seemed to read his mind during dangerous operations. As the formal program concluded and the mingling resumed, Jason found himself approached by a young woman in an elegant blue dress. She introduced herself as Aurora Griffin, a journalist covering the event for a military magazine. She was genuinely interested in hearing stories from veterans, not for headlines, but because her brother had served as a dog handler in Iraq. "I can tell you have a connection to this cause," Aurora said, her voice gentle but perceptive. "The way you watch those videos, it reminded me of how my brother looked when he talked about his partner, Zeus." Jason appreciated her sincerity, a rare quality in this room, full of people who seemed more interested in being seen than actually seeing others. He found himself sharing carefully edited versions of his experiences, talking about the incredible bond between handlers and their dogs without mentioning specific operations or the pain of losing Arya. Aurora listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed she understood the depth of what these partnerships meant. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a man who radiated wealth and arrogance in equal measure. Ethan Boone was a defense contractor who had made millions, selling equipment to the military while never spending a day in uniform himself. His custom suit probably cost more than Jason's monthly disability payment, and his Rolex caught the light as he gestured dismissively. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his tone making it clear he wasn't actually asking permission, "but I believe you're in my seat." Jason looked around. There were no assigned seats in this section, and dozens of empty chairs scattered throughout the area. He met Ethan's gaze calmly. "I don't see your name on it." Ethan's laugh was sharp and condescending. "Listen, friend, I paid $25,000 to be here tonight. I don't think you understand the caliber of people at this event." His eyes scanned Jason's modest attire with obvious disdain. "This isn't exactly a casual dinner at the local VFW hall." Aurora shifted uncomfortably beside them, recognizing the brewing confrontation. Other nearby guests began to take notice, their conversations quieting as they sensed drama unfolding. Jason remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged. He'd faced down armed insurgents in desert compounds. A wealthy civilian with an oversized ego wasn't particularly intimidating. "You're right," Jason said quietly, his British accent carrying a hint of steel beneath the calm surface. "I probably don't belong here." Ethan smirked, apparently taking this as validation of his superior status. "Exactly. Look, I'm sure you mean well, but these events are networking opportunities for serious people making serious decisions about defense contracts worth hundreds of millions. It's not personal. It's just business." Several other contractors and their guests had gravitated toward the conversation, some looking uncomfortable, while others seemed entertained by Ethan's display of dominance. Among them was Camilla Hawkins, a Pentagon liaison who specialized in military procurement, and Henry Barnes, a retired colonel who now worked as a consultant for various defense firms. Jason stood slowly, his movements controlled and precise. Even at rest, there was something about his posture that suggested coiled energy, like a spring under tension. "What kind of business are you in, exactly?" Ethan straightened his tie, clearly enjoying having an audience. "I supply advanced communication systems to forward operating bases. Last quarter alone, my company secured $47 million in contracts. We keep soldiers connected and alive in hostile territory." He paused for effect. "What do you do?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Jason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that Ethan's words had struck a nerve. The implication was clear, that Jason was somehow less valuable, less important than those who profited from war while others fought it. Aurora stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Gentlemen, perhaps we could—" "No, it's all right," Jason interrupted gently, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made several people unconsciously step back. "Mr. Boone asked a fair question." He looked directly at Ethan. "I was the one who used your communication systems in places where if they failed, people died." The subtle emphasis on "if they failed" was not lost on anyone present. Ethan's confidence wavered slightly, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "Well, then you should appreciate the quality of our equipment. Do you have any idea how much research and development goes into—" "I know that your Model 7 radio system has a failure rate of nearly 12% in extreme heat," Jason said quietly. I know because I was there when Sergeant Liam Bennett's unit lost contact during a firefight outside Helmand. They were pinned down for 6 hours because your advanced communication system couldn't handle the temperature. The color began to drain from Ethan's face, but he pressed on, his voice becoming more defensive. Equipment failure is a reality in combat. We can't account for every variable. Bennett died waiting for backup that couldn't find his position, Jason continued, his tone never rising but somehow becoming more intense, along with Corporals Lucas Barnes and Harper Fleming, all because a $20,000 radio failed when they needed it most. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Camilla Hawkins shifted nervously, recognizing the names Jason had mentioned. They were documented casualties from operations she had reviewed in Pentagon briefings. Henry Barnes, who had commanded troops in both Iraq and Afghanistan, studied Jason with new interest, beginning to piece together who he might be. Ethan, realizing he was losing control of the narrative, tried to regain his footing. Look, I appreciate your service, I really do, but you can't blame equipment manufacturers for every tragedy of war. These things happen, Jason repeated, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. When people prioritize profit margins over the lives of 18-year-old kids who trust that the gear they're given will bring them home. The confrontation was drawing attention from across the ballroom. Several high-ranking military officers had noticed the commotion, and a few were moving in their direction. Among them was General William Black, the evening's keynote speaker, and Ella Fleming, a Defense Department official who oversaw military contracts. Ethan, sensing he was being outmaneuvered but too proud to back down, made his fatal mistake. You know what your problem is? You people always want someone to blame for the ugly realities of war, but this is how the world works. There are those who make decisions and write checks, and there are those who follow orders. I'm sorry you had a bad experience, but that doesn't give you the right to lecture people who are actually making a difference. The words, "you people" and "follow orders" hit the gathering like physical blows. Aurora actually gasped audibly, while Henry Barnes's expression hardened into something approaching fury. Even some of Ethan's colleagues looked mortified by his tone-deaf arrogance. Jason stood perfectly still for a long moment, his breathing controlled and even. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had led men through hell and brought them home alive. You're absolutely right about one thing, Mr. Boone. There are those who make decisions, and there are those who live with the consequences. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted not just the photograph of himself and Arya, but several others, images of young soldiers, some barely old enough to shave, all wearing the same uniform he had once worn. These are the people who followed orders. Lance Corporal Ethan Wheeler, age 19. Specialist Emma Bennett, 22. Sergeant Jack Larson, 24. He placed each photo on the table between them like cards in a deadly serious game. Each one of them trusted that the equipment they carried would work when their lives depended on it. Each one of them believed that the people back home, people like you, understood that cutting corners or prioritizing profit margins could mean the difference between a family getting a folded flag or a living son or daughter. The crowd around them had grown larger, and the energy in the room was shifting palpably. People who had been laughing and networking moments before now stood, transfixed by the quiet intensity of Jason's words. Several military officers were recording the confrontation on their phones, recognizing that something significant was unfolding. Ethan, clearly out of his depth but too committed to retreat, made one last desperate attempt to assert his authority. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I've been coming to these events for 15 years. I have relationships with generals, senators, Pentagon officials. You can't just waltz in here and start making accusations about equipment failures. And accusations? Jason's voice was still quiet, but now it carried something that made even the most senior officers in the room pay attention. Mr. Boone, I don't make accusations. I state facts. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through a series of documents. After action. Reports, equipment failure analyses, congressional testimony transcripts. Would you like me to read the official investigation into the Helmand Province incident? The one that specifically cited communication equipment failures as a contributing factor to casualties? Or perhaps the GAO report on defense contractor oversight that mentions your company by name? General Black had now reached the edge of the group, his presence immediately recognizable to everyone present. Behind him were several Pentagon officials and at least 3 members of Congress who served on defense committees. The room's atmosphere had completely transformed from a social gathering to something approaching a tribunal. Ethan glanced around desperately, finally beginning to understand that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The people he had expected to support him, fellow contractors and defense industry insiders, were now looking at him with expressions ranging from embarrassment to outright hostility. In military and defense circles, attacking a veteran's service record, especially one who clearly had combat experience, was considered beyond the pale. Jason carefully returned the photographs to his wallet, his movements deliberate and respectful. I came here tonight to honor the memory of my partner, a military working dog named Arya, who gave her life in service to this country. I didn't come here to debate the ethics of defense contracting or to challenge anyone's right to be here. He paused, meeting Ethan's eyes one final time. But I also won't stand by while someone dismisses the sacrifice of better people than either of us will ever be. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the background noise of the larger gala seemed to fade as word spread through the ballroom that something extraordinary was happening in the corner. Aurora Griffin found herself instinctively reaching for her recorder, journalist instincts recognizing that she was witnessing a moment that would be talked about for years to come. General Black stepped forward, his expression grave but respectful. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." He looked directly at Jason. "Son, I believe we may have met before. Would you mind if I had a word with you?" The question was posed politely, but everyone present understood it was not really a request. As Jason nodded and prepared to follow the general, Ethan made one final, desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. "General, I hope you understand that I was simply trying to maintain the appropriate atmosphere for this event. Sometimes people attend who don't really understand the significance." General Black turned to face Ethan with an expression that could have frozen steel. "Mr. Boone, I suggest you choose your next words very carefully, because the man you've been lecturing about understanding significance just spent the last 3 years believing his canine partner died in his arms during an operation that saved 17 American lives." The words hit the gathering like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed from multiple directions as the implications sank in. This wasn't just any veteran. This was someone whose story the general knew personally, someone whose service record commanded respect at the highest levels of military leadership. But General Black wasn't finished. "And before you say another word about who belongs at an event honoring military working dogs, you should know that the reason we're all here tonight, the reason this foundation exists, is because of handlers like this man and partners like the one he lost." As the general's words settled over the crowd, Jason felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the recognition that Arya's sacrifice and his own service still mattered to people who understood its true cost. But he also felt the familiar weight of grief, the hollow ache that came with remembering what he had lost. What Jason didn't know, what none of them knew, was that at that very moment, in a veterinary rehabilitation facility 3 miles away, a German Shepherd with distinctive markings, was taking her first tentative steps after months of recovery from injuries that had been misreported as fatal 3 years earlier. The dog's rehabilitation specialist had been trying for weeks to locate her original handler, a British soldier whose name was listed in her file as Jason Statham. The evening that had started as a simple charity gala was about to become something far more significant, a convergence of justice, redemption, and the kind of miracle that proves some bonds can survive even the worst that war can inflict. But first, there were truths to be revealed and accounts to be settled. The peaceful beginning had been thoroughly disturbed, and Jason Statham, shaped by years of combat and loss, now stood at the center of a confrontation that would expose not just Ethan Boone's arrogance, but a much larger web of corruption and callousness that had cost too many lives and damaged too many souls. General Black's words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, and Jason found himself surrounded by a circle of faces that had transformed from dismissive to deeply respectful in a matter of moments. The revelation that he was not just any veteran, but someone whose story had reached the highest levels of military command, sent ripples of whisper and recognition through the gathering crowd. Ethan Boone stood frozen, his face pale as the reality of his catastrophic misjudgment became clear to everyone present. Jason's past was written in scars, both visible and hidden, carved by years of service in places most people couldn't pronounce, let alone survive. His journey to this moment had begun 20 years earlier in the rough neighborhoods of East London, where a teenage Jason had found himself at a crossroads between a life of petty crime and something greater. The military had been his salvation, offering structure, purpose, and the chance to channel his natural intensity into something that mattered. His early years in the Special Forces had been marked by an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure and an intuitive understanding of tactics that impressed even seasoned veterans. But it was his partnership with military working dogs that truly defined his career. Jason possessed a rare gift for connecting with animals that had been traumatized or written off as untrainable. Where other handlers saw aggressive or fearful dogs, Jason saw creatures that simply needed someone to understand their pain. Aria had been his third canine partner, but the bond they shared transcended anything he had experienced before. She had been rescued from a dogfighting ring in Kabul, her body bearing scars from abuse, but her spirit somehow intact. Military veterinarians had recommended she be put down, declaring her too damaged psychologically to serve as a working dog. Jason had spent 3 days sitting beside her kennel, not speaking, just being present until she finally approached the fence and allowed him to touch her scarred muzzle. Their partnership had been forged in fire and sealed with blood across multiple deployments. Aria had an uncanny ability to detect improvised explosive devices, often alerting Jason to threats that sophisticated equipment missed. She had saved dozens of lives, including Jason's own, on more occasions than he liked to count. The morning of their final mission together, she had seemed restless, pacing in their shared quarters and whining softly. Behavior Jason now realized might have been her trying to warn him about what was coming. The explosion that separated them had been massive, the result of a coordinated ambush that caught their convoy in a carefully prepared kill zone. Jason remembered the moment of impact with crystalline clarity, the world tilting sideways, the sensation of flying through the air, and then darkness. When he awakened in the field hospital, his first word had been Aria's name. The medical staff had exchanged uncomfortable glances before informing him that his partner hadn't survived the blast. What they hadn't told him, what no one had known at the time, was that Aria had been thrown clear of the explosion, injured but alive. In the chaos of evacuating human casualties, she had been left behind, later found by local villagers who nursed her back to health. By the time military personnel returned to secure the area, she was gone, presumed dead, along with several other pieces of equipment that couldn't be immediately accounted for. The 3 years since that day had been a descent into a personal hell that Jason hid behind a facade of steady competence. He had been medically retired due to his injuries, receiving a comfortable pension and full benefits, but money couldn't fill the void left by losing his partner. He had tried therapy, support groups, even medication, but nothing could quiet the voice in his head that whispered he had failed in his most important duty, protecting Arya. His modest apartment was filled with reminders of their service together, commendations, photographs, even her favorite tennis ball, which he had somehow managed to recover from their quarters before leaving Afghanistan. He spoke to her photograph every morning, updating her on his day as if she was still there listening with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything he couldn't say out loud. Now, standing in the opulent ballroom surrounded by people who suddenly saw him differently, Jason felt the familiar weight of survivor's guilt pressing down on his shoulders. Ethan Boone's casual dismissal of military sacrifice had torn open wounds that never fully healed, reminding him of all the young soldiers who had trusted faulty equipment and paid the ultimate price. General Black placed a firm hand on Jason's shoulder, his expression carrying both authority and genuine warmth. "Son, would you walk with me for a moment? There are some people I'd like you to meet." As they moved away from the confrontation, Jason could hear heated whispers erupting behind them. Aurora Griffin was quietly but firmly questioning Ethan about the specific equipment failures Jason had mentioned, her journalist instincts recognizing a significant story. Several defense contractors were distancing themselves from Boone, clearly concerned about being associated with someone who had just publicly attacked a decorated veteran's service record. The general led Jason toward a quieter section of the ballroom where several high-ranking officials were engaged in more serious conversations. Among them was Admiral Emma Castro, who oversaw military procurement for the Navy, and Colonel Harper Hunter, a decorated officer who had served multiple tours in Afghanistan and understood exactly what Jason had endured. "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet someone," General Black announced as they approached the group. "This is Jason Statham, one of the finest military dog handlers I've had the privilege to serve alongside." The recognition in their eyes was immediate and profound. Admiral Castro stepped forward, extending her hand with genuine respect. "Mr. Statham, your reputation precedes you. I've read the after-action reports from your deployments. The work you and your partner did in Helmand Province saved countless lives." Jason accepted the handshake, though compliments about his service always made him uncomfortable. "I was just doing my job, Admiral. Arya deserves the credit. She was the one with the real skills." Colonel Hunter's expression grew somber at the mention of Arya's name. "We heard about what happened. I'm sorry for your loss. Losing a partner is..." She paused, searching for words. "It's something civilians can't understand." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a woman in an elegant black dress who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to military protocol. She introduced herself as Dr. Sophia Freeman, a veterinarian who specialized in treating military working dogs and their psychological trauma. Her presence at the gala was professional. She was scheduled to speak about advances in canine PTSD treatment. "Excuse me for interrupting," Dr. Freeman said, her voice carrying a slight urgency that caught Jason's attention immediately. "But I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. Did you mention a partner named Arya, who was lost in Afghanistan 3 years ago?" Jason felt his chest tighten at the question. Talking about Arya with fellow military personnel was difficult enough. Discussing her with a stranger felt like reopening a wound that had never properly healed. "Yes, that's correct." Dr. Freeman's expression became intensely focused, and she pulled out her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be a database or file system. This might seem like an unusual question, but what were Arya's distinctive markings? Any scars? Or identifying features? The question caught Jason off guard. Why would a veterinarian he'd never met need details about a dog who had been dead for 3 years? But something in her tone suggested this wasn't casual curiosity. She had a white patch on her chest, shaped like a crescent moon, and 3 parallel scars on her left rear leg from before I knew her. Why do you ask? Dr. Freeman's face went pale, and she exchanged meaningful glances with General Black. Mr. Statham, I need you to sit down for what I'm about to tell you. The words sent ice through Jason's veins. In his experience, conversations that began with, "You need to sit down," never ended well. Around them, the other officers sensed the gravity of the moment and quietly formed a protective circle, creating privacy in the middle of the crowded gala. 3 months ago, Dr. Freeman continued, her voice carefully controlled, a German shepherd was brought to our rehabilitation facility in Virginia. She had been living with a family in Afghanistan who found her after some kind of explosion. They cared for her for years, but her injuries never healed properly, and they finally reached out to military contacts to see if she could get proper treatment. Jason's world seemed to tilt slightly, the same sensation he'd experienced during the explosion that had changed everything. What are you saying? The dog matched the description of a military working dog reported killed in action 3 years. Ego. We've been trying to locate her original handler, a British soldier named Jason Statham, for weeks. The silence that followed was so complete that Jason could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The faces around him seemed to blur as the implications of Dr. Freeman's words crashed over him like a tsunami. Arya, his Arya, might be alive. The partner he had mourned for 3 years, the loss that had nearly destroyed him, might have been surviving on her own while he grieved her death. General Black's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Doctor, are you certain about this?" "We ran DNA tests against hair samples from her original kennel records. It's definitely the same dog. She's been through extensive rehabilitation for injuries to her hind legs and some psychological trauma, but she's made remarkable progress." "Doctor." Freeman paused, studying Jason's face with professional concern. "Mr. Statham, are you all right?" Jason wasn't all right. He felt as if the ground beneath his feet had become quicksand, threatening to swallow him whole. 3 years of grief, guilt, and self-recrimination were crashing against the possibility that everything he believed about that terrible day had been wrong. If Maria was alive, if she had been waiting for him all this time while he had given up hope. Colonel Hunter stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Jason, this is good news. This is what every handler dreams of, getting their partner back. But Jason's mind was racing through darker possibilities. If Arya was alive, why hadn't she been found sooner? How badly was she injured? Did she remember him? Or had 3 years of separation and trauma erased their bond? And perhaps most terrifyingly, what if he didn't deserve her trust anymore? What if his failure to protect her that day had broken something that couldn't be repaired? "Where is she now?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "At the Warrior Canine Connection facility in Virginia," Dr. Freeman replied. "She's been making excellent progress, but..." She hesitated, clearly trying to find the right words. "She's been withdrawn around strangers. We think she's been waiting for someone specific." The words hit Jason like a physical blow. The image of Arya, injured and alone, waiting for him to come for her while he had been convinced she was dead, was almost unbearable. He had failed her not once but twice, first by letting her get hurt, and then by giving up on her when she needed him most. Admiral Castro, who had been quietly observing the conversation, stepped forward with characteristic naval directness. "Dr. Freeman, what does Arya need right now? What's the next step?" Ideally, we'd like her original handler to visit as soon as possible. The reunion could be therapeutic for both of them, but it needs to be handled carefully. 3 years is a long time, and we don't know how either of them will react. Jason felt the weight of every eye in their small circle focused on him, waiting for his response. The rational part of his mind understood that this was an opportunity for redemption, a chance to reclaim something precious that he had thought was lost forever. But the part of him that had been shaped by trauma and loss whispered that this was too good to be true, that somehow he would find a way to fail Arya again. The confrontation with Ethan Boone suddenly seemed trivial compared to this revelation. A few yards away, he could see the defense contractor still trying to justify his earlier comments to an increasingly hostile audience. But Jason no longer cared about exposing corruption or defending his service record. All that mattered was the possibility that Arya was alive and that he might have a chance to make things right. General Black seemed to understand the emotional weight of the moment. "Son, I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to know that you have the full support of this command. Whatever you need, transportation, time off, medical support, consider it done." Jason nodded gratefully, though he wasn't sure he trusted himself to speak. The offer of institutional support was generous, but this was a journey he would have to make alone. After 3 years of carrying guilt and grief, the possibility of seeing Arya again felt both like salvation and the most terrifying challenge he had ever faced. Dr. Freeman handed him a business card with her contact information. "Take some time to process this. When you're ready, call me and we'll arrange for you to visit. But Jason..." She paused, making sure she had his full attention. "She's been waiting for you. Don't wait too long." As the small group began to disperse, each offering words of encouragement and support, Jason found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time since the evening began. The gala continued around him, but he felt disconnected from the celebration, lost in the possibility that everything he had believed about his greatest failure might be wrong. Across the room, he could see Aurora Griffin approaching, her expression suggesting she had more questions about both the confrontation with Ethan Boone and the subsequent revelation about Arya. But Jason wasn't ready to talk to anyone else, wasn't ready to put words to the hurricane of emotions churning inside him. Instead, he pulled out his phone and looked at the contact information Dr. Freeman had given him. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether he was brave enough to face the possibility of redemption, or whether some failures were too deep to overcome, even when the universe offered a second chance. The morning after the gala dawned gray and cold, matching Jason's internal landscape as he stood in his sparse apartment staring at Dr. Freeman's business card. He had barely slept, his mind cycling between hope and terror as he contemplated what lay ahead. The revelation that Arya might be alive had shattered the carefully constructed narrative he had built around his guilt and loss, leaving him adrift. In unfamiliar emotional territory, Jason's apartment reflected the disciplined austerity of his military background. Functional furniture, minimal decorations, everything in its proper place. But tucked into one corner was a shrine of sorts. A small table holding Arya's collar, her favorite tennis ball, and a folded American flag from his retirement ceremony. Above it hung their last photograph together, both of them grinning, despite being covered in Afghan dust. For 3 years, this corner had been his place of mourning. Now it felt like evidence of his failure to keep faith. At precisely 800 hours, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Freeman's number, and Jason felt his pulse quicken as he answered. "Mr. Statham, I hope I'm not calling too early." Her voice was professional but warm. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night. Have you had time to consider visiting Arya?" Jason had been asking himself the same question all night. "I have some concerns," he admitted. "It's been 3 years. What if she doesn't remember me? What if seeing me causes her distress?" Dr. Freeman's response revealed the depth of her experience with traumatized military animals. Those are valid concerns, but in my professional opinion, the bond between a handler and their partner doesn't simply disappear. We've seen remarkable recoveries when military working dogs are reunited with their original handlers, even after extended separations. She paused before continuing. There's something else you should know. Arya has been resistant to bonding with new handlers. We've had several experienced personnel try to work with her, but she remains withdrawn. It's as if she's waiting for someone specific. The words sent a spike of both hope and anguish through Jason's chest. The thought of Arya rejecting other handlers because she was waiting for him was almost too much to bear. If true, it meant she had never given up hope, even when he had. When could I see her, he asked, the words emerging before his rational mind could stop them. Today, if you're ready. The facility is about a 3-hour drive from DC. I could meet you there this afternoon. Jason closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on him. Every instinct told him to say yes, to drop everything and race to Virginia, to see if the impossible was really true. But another voice, the one shaped by 3 years of guilt and self-recrimination, whispered that he would only cause more harm. I'll be there, he said finally. Send me the address. After ending the call, Jason stood motionless in his apartment for several minutes, trying to process what he had just committed to. The rational part of his mind began making lists. He would need to arrange transportation, clear his schedule, and mentally prepare for what might be an emotionally devastating experience. But underneath the practical considerations lay a current of raw emotion that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. As he prepared to leave, Jason's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but troubling. Saw the news about last night. Some people don't know when to leave well enough alone. Be careful. The sender was anonymous, but the implication was clear. Someone had been watching the confrontation with Ethan Boone and was not pleased with how it had unfolded. Jason deleted the message without much thought. He had dealt with more serious threats than anonymous texts, and today his focus needed to be entirely on the possibility of seeing Arya again. But as he walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that the events at the gala had set something larger in motion, something that extended beyond a simple clash of egos between a veteran and a defense contractor. The drive to Virginia gave Jason time to think, perhaps too much time. As familiar landmarks passed by his window, his mind drifted back to the early days of his partnership with Arya. He remembered the first time she had trusted him enough to take food from his hand, the gradual process of building communication, and mutual respect that had eventually evolved into something approaching telepathy. Their greatest success had come during a complex operation to clear a suspected terrorist safehouse in Kandahar province. Intelligence suggested the building was rigged with multiple IEDs designed to kill anyone who entered. Standard procedure would have been to call in an airstrike, but civilian hostages inside made that option unacceptable. Jason and Arya had spent 6 hours methodically clearing the building, her nose detecting explosives that electronic equipment had missed, his steady presence keeping her calm and focused despite the obvious danger. They had saved 14 civilians that day, including 3 children under the age of 10. The operation had earned Jason a commendation and Arya a formal recognition as a hero animal. But the real reward had been the look of satisfaction in her eyes as they emerged from the building with all hostages safe. She had known she had done something important, and her pride had been infectious. Now, driving toward what might be their reunion, Jason wondered if Arya would remember those moments of triumph, or if 3 years of separation and trauma had erased the bond they had shared. The psychological literature on military working dogs suggested that traumatic experiences could profoundly alter an animal's personality and capacity for trust. What if the Aria he remembered no longer existed? As he approached the Warrior Canine Connection facility, Jason's phone rang again. This time the caller was Aurora Griffin, the journalist from the previous evening. "Mr. Statham, I hope you don't mind me calling," she began. "I've been researching the equipment failures you mentioned last night, and I think there's a much larger story here." Jason's attention was immediately focused. "What kind of story?" "I've found documentation of at least 17 separate incidents involving Ethan Boone's communication systems over the past 5 years. Equipment failures that resulted in casualties, delayed evacuations, and compromised operations. But here's the interesting part. Every time a formal investigation was launched, it was shut down or classified before reaching any conclusions. The implications were staggering. If Aurora was correct, the confrontation at the gala had exposed not just one man's arrogance, but a pattern of systematic cover-ups that had cost lives. Jason felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same rage that had sustained him through countless dangerous missions. "Who's shutting down the investigations?" he asked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out, but I think last night's confrontation has rattled some powerful people. I've already received calls from 3 Pentagon officials asking about my interest in defense contractor oversight." Jason was approaching the entrance to the canine facility, but Aurora's words demanded his attention. "Are you suggesting there's a conspiracy to protect Boone's company?" "I'm suggesting that there are people with a vested interest in making sure certain information never becomes public. And after last night, they know you're someone who might not stay quiet about what you've seen." The anonymous text message from earlier suddenly took on new significance. If Aurora was correct, Jason had unknowingly stumbled into something much larger than a simple confrontation with an arrogant defense contractor. But right now, none of that mattered as much as what waited for him inside the facility. "I have to go," he told Aurora, "but let's talk more about this later." The Warrior Canine Connection facility was a sprawling complex of buildings, designed specifically for the rehabilitation of military working dogs. As Jason parked and approached the main entrance, he could hear the sound of dogs barking in the distance. Not the aggressive barking of agitated animals, but the playful sounds of creatures that were learning to trust again. Dr. Freeman met him at the reception desk, her expression carefully neutral as she led him through a series of corridors, lined with photographs of successful reunions between handlers and their partners. Each image told a story of healing and redemption, but Jason found himself wondering how many stories ended differently, with dogs too damaged to recover or handlers too broken to rebuild their bonds. "Before we go to Aria," Dr. Freeman said, as they walked, "I want to prepare you for what you might see. She's physically healthy now, but 3 years of uncertainty have left their mark. She may not react the way you expect." They stopped outside a door marked Rehabilitation Wing, and Dr. Freeman turned to face Jason directly. "Are you ready for this?" Jason nodded, though he wasn't sure anyone could truly be ready for such a moment. Dr. Freeman opened the door and led him into a large, open space filled with various obstacles and training equipment. At the far end of the room, sitting perfectly still and facing away from them, was a German shepherd that Jason would have recognized anywhere. Aria was older, her coat showing flecks of gray around the muzzle, and she held her left rear leg at a slight angle that suggested old injuries. But there was no question it was her. The distinctive white patch on her chest, the alert set of her ears, the controlled stillness that had always marked her as a professional among amateurs. "Aria," Jason called softly, his voice barely above. A whisper. The dog's ears twitched, but she didn't turn around. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened. Then slowly, Arya began to turn her head, and Jason found himself looking into the intelligent brown eyes that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. The recognition was instant and overwhelming. Arya's entire body seemed to vibrate with emotion. As she processed what she was seeing, her tail began to wag tentatively, then with increasing enthusiasm as she realized that the impossible had happened. Her handler had finally come for her. But instead of rushing toward him as Jason expected, Arya remained in place, her body language suggesting a mixture of joy and uncertainty. 3 years of abandonment had taught her to be cautious. Even when presented with her deepest wish, Jason understood her hesitation in a way that only someone who had experienced similar trauma could. He slowly lowered himself to one knee and extended his hand, palm up, in the same gesture he had used when they first met years ago in Afghanistan. "It's all right, girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here now. I'm sorry I took so long." At the sound of his voice speaking, the familiar words of reassurance, something in Arya's posture shifted. The professional reserve she had maintained crumbled, and she began moving toward him with the careful gait of an animal that had learned to compensate for old injuries. When she reached him, Arya pressed her head against his chest and released a sound that was part whine, part sigh, the vocalization of a creature that had been holding her breath for 3 years and could finally exhale. Jason wrapped his arms around her, feeling the solid warmth of her body and breathing in the familiar scent that had always meant safety and partnership. "I thought you were dead," he whispered into her fur. "I thought I'd lost you forever." For several minutes, they remained locked in their reunion, both of them processing emotions too complex for words. Dr. Freeman watched from a respectful distance, her eyes moist as she witnessed the kind of bond that made her chosen profession worthwhile. But even in the midst of overwhelming joy, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that their reunion was being observed by unfriendly eyes. The anonymous text message, Aurora's investigation, and the larger implications of the previous night's confrontation created an undercurrent of tension that threatened to intrude on what should have been a purely positive moment. As if sensing his unease, Arya pulled back slightly and looked directly into his eyes. Her gaze was questioning, alert to dangers that her training had taught her to detect. She had always been able to read his moods, and apparently 3 years of separation hadn't diminished that ability. "What is it, girl?" Jason asked, his hand moving to stroke her head in the calming gesture that had always soothed her anxiety. Arya's response was to move closer to the window overlooking the facility's parking area, her posture suggesting she had detected something that required investigation. Jason followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. Parked across the street from the facility was a black sedan with tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that suggested official surveillance. As Jason watched, the car's engine started and it pulled away, but not before he caught a glimpse of the occupants, 2 men in business suits who looked distinctly out of place in the rural Virginia setting. Dr. Freeman had noticed his distraction and followed his gaze to the departing vehicle. "Do you know those men?" Jason shook his head, but his military instincts were screaming warnings. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Someone had known he would be here today, and that someone wanted him to know he was being watched. The reunion with Arya had been everything he had hoped for and more, but it was becoming clear that their story was intersecting with something larger and potentially dangerous. The confrontation with Ethan Boone had apparently exposed a network of corruption that extended far beyond one man's arrogance. And now, Jason found himself at the center of a conflict that threatened not just his own safety, but potentially Arya's. As well, as he looked down at his partner, now alert and scanning for threats in the way that had kept them both alive in Afghanistan, Jason realized that their greatest challenge wasn't behind them. It was just beginning. The drive back to Washington, with Arya beside him, felt surreal, like emerging from a 3-year nightmare into a world where miracles were possible. She sat in the passenger seat with the calm alertness of a professional, occasionally glancing at Jason as if to confirm he was really there. But beneath their joy lay an undercurrent of tension, both from the surveillance they had witnessed at the facility and from the knowledge that their reunion had occurred against a backdrop of larger, more dangerous forces. Jason had arranged for temporary housing that would accommodate Arya, but as they approached his apartment building, he noticed another black sedan parked across the street. This one made no attempt to hide its presence, a clear message that his movements were being monitored. Arya's ears perked up as they passed the vehicle, her training recognizing the signs of surveillance even after 3 years of civilian life. Inside his apartment, Jason watched as Arya carefully explored the space, her nose processing the accumulated sense of his life since their separation. She paused at the corner where he had created his memorial to her, studying the collar and tennis ball with an expression that seemed almost confused. The sight of her own belongings, preserved like relics of the dead, appeared to trouble her in ways Jason hadn't anticipated. "I know it's strange, girl," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "I thought you were gone. I was trying to keep your memory alive." Arya looked at him with those intelligent brown eyes, then deliberately picked up the tennis ball in her mouth and brought it to him. The same gesture she had used countless times in Afghanistan to initiate their off-duty play sessions. The message was clear. She wasn't a memory to be preserved, but a living partner ready to resume their interrupted life together. Their quiet reunion was interrupted by Jason's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Aurora Griffin's number, and Jason answered with growing concern about what new developments her investigation might have uncovered. "Jason, we need to talk." Aurora's voice carried an urgency that immediately put him on alert. "I've been digging deeper into the defense contractor connections, and what I've found is bigger than I imagined. Can you meet me somewhere secure?" Jason glanced at Arya, who was watching him with the focused attention that had always indicated she sensed important communications. "What kind of secure?" "There's a cafe in Georgetown called Luna's. It's always crowded, good for privacy. But, Jason, bring Arya. I think she might be safer with you than alone." The implication that Arya might be in danger sent ice through Jason's veins. He had gotten her back only to potentially put her at risk again, but Aurora's tone suggested that separation might be even more dangerous. An hour later, Jason and Arya entered Luna's cafe, a bustling establishment filled with students, professionals, and tourists. Aurora had chosen a corner table with clear sightlines to all entrances, her journalist instincts understanding operational security, even if she lacked formal training. When she saw them approaching, her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "She's beautiful," Aurora said as they sat down, Arya positioning herself where she could monitor the room while staying close to Jason. "You can see the intelligence in her eyes." "What did you find?" Jason asked, his hand resting protectively on Arya's head. Aurora pulled out a tablet and showed him a series of documents she had obtained through investigative contacts. "The equipment, failures you mentioned at the gala, are part of a pattern that goes back 7 years. Ethan Boone's company, Advanced Tactical Communications, has been delivering substandard equipment to forward operating bases while falsifying quality control reports." Jason studied the documents, his anger building as he recognized unit designations and operation names from his own deployments. "How is this possible? Military procurement has multiple oversight layers." "That's where it gets interesting," Aurora continued, lowering her voice as she pulled up additional files. "The oversight officials responsible for equipment inspection include several people who were at the gala last night. They've been receiving consulting fees from ATC while simultaneously approving equipment that they knew was defective. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Jason realized he was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that had directly contributed to casualties in operations he had participated in, including some where Arya had been instrumental in saving lives despite equipment failures. "There's more," Aurora said, showing him photographs from the gala. "After your confrontation with Boone, I stayed and watched the reactions. Several people made phone calls immediately after General Black revealed your identity. I think they were coordinating damage control." Jason studied the images, recognizing faces of Pentagon officials and defense contractors who had seemed supportive during his conversation with General Black. The possibility that some of them might be involved in the corruption network added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. Arya suddenly tensed beside him, her attention focused on the cafe's front entrance. Jason followed her gaze and felt his blood pressure spike. Ethan Boone had just entered, accompanied by two men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the predatory confidence of high-priced lawyers or corporate security specialists. "He's seen us," Aurora whispered, noticing Boone's direct stare in their direction. Jason's first instinct was to confront Boone directly, but Arya's presence changed the calculus. He couldn't risk putting her in danger, especially after just getting her back. Instead, he began calculating exit strategies while keeping his expression neutral. Boone approached their table with the artificial confidence of someone who believed wealth and connections made him untouchable. His companions flanked him in a formation that suggested they were accustomed to intimidating people on his behalf. "Mr. Statham," Boone said, his voice carrying false joviality that fooled no one. "What a pleasant surprise. I was hoping we might have a chance to clear the air after last night's unfortunate misunderstanding." Jason remained seated, his hand still resting protectively on Arya's head. She was completely still, but he could feel the tension in her muscles, the same controlled readiness she had displayed before engaging hostile targets in Afghanistan. "I don't think there was any misunderstanding," Jason replied calmly. "You made your position quite clear." One of Boone's companions stepped closer, his movements designed to be intimidating. "Mr. Boone is trying to be reasonable here. Perhaps you should consider the wisdom of accepting his offer to discuss this privately." The implied threat was obvious, but what Boone and his associates hadn't counted on was Arya's presence. Military working dogs were trained to protect their handlers, and her years of combat experience had taught her to recognize aggressive body language regardless of the setting. Arya rose to her feet and positioned herself between Jason and the threatening man, her posture shifting into what any experienced soldier would recognize as a combat stance. She made no sound, but her message was unmistakable. Any move toward her handler would be met with decisive action. The effect on Boone's companions was immediate and telling. Both men stepped back, their confident demeanor replaced by wary respect. For a creature they suddenly realized was far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Arya's reputation as a combat veteran was apparently known to people who had done their research. "Interesting friends you have," Aurora observed quietly, her tablet now recording video of the confrontation. "Are these the kind of people who send anonymous, threatening text messages?" Boone's face flushed with anger at the suggestion that he might be involved in intimidation tactics. "I don't know what you're implying, but I came here to offer Mr. Statham an opportunity to reconsider his position. There are significant financial benefits to being reasonable about these matters." Jason felt a wave of disgust at the crude attempt at bribery. "And if I'm not interested in being reasonable, then you might find that your recent good fortune becomes considerably less fortunate," one of Boone's companions said, his eyes moving meaningfully toward Arya. "Accidents happen, especially to valuable animals." The threat against Arya triggered something primal in Jason's psychology. The rational, controlled operator was instantly replaced by something far more dangerous. A man who had lost his partner once and would kill to prevent it from happening again. He stood slowly, Arya immediately adjusting her position to maintain protective coverage. When Jason spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect in life or death situations. "Let me make something very clear," he said, each word precisely enunciated. "If anything happens to her, anything at all, I will hold you personally responsible. And unlike you, I don't need lawyers or corporate security to handle my problems." The temperature in the cafe seemed to drop several degrees as other patrons began noticing the confrontation. Several people were discreetly recording the exchange on their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something significant unfolding between a decorated veteran and what appeared to be wealthy civilians making threats. Boone's carefully constructed mask of civility finally slipped completely. "You think your little display of heroics last night makes you untouchable. You have no idea who you're dealing with or how deep this goes. There are people involved in this who could end your pension, your benefits, your entire life with a phone call." Aurora had been recording the entire exchange, and she now spoke up with the fearless directness that made her an effective investigative journalist. "Are you threatening a decorated combat veteran on camera, Mr. Boone? Because I'm sure my readers would find that very interesting, especially given what we've uncovered about your company's equipment failures." The mention of equipment failures sent visible panic across Boone's face. Clearly, he hadn't expected Aurora's investigation to progress so quickly or to be confronted so directly about the corruption allegations. His companions exchanged meaningful glances, communicating through the subtle body language of people accustomed to coordinating damage control. "Miss Griffin," one of them said, his tone taking on the measured cadence of legal intimidation, "I hope you're aware of the liability issues associated with publishing unsubstantiated allegations against defense contractors. The legal consequences could be quite severe, but Aurora had done her homework and wasn't easily intimidated. Unsubstantiated. I have documentation of 17 equipment failures resulting in casualties, falsified quality control reports, and evidence of payments. To oversight officials, which part would you like me to substantiate first?" Jason watched the exchange with growing admiration for Aurora's courage and growing concern for her safety. She was clearly in possession of information that could destroy careers and potentially result in criminal charges for multiple high-ranking officials. That made her extremely valuable as an ally and extremely dangerous as an enemy to the corruption network. Uria, meanwhile, had not relaxed her protective stance. Her combat experience had taught her to remain alert until threats were completely neutralized, and these men still radiated hostile intent despite their attempts at legal intimidation. Her presence was clearly making Boone's associates nervous. They were accustomed to dealing with soft civilian targets, not combat veterans backed by partners trained to detect and neutralize threats. The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of someone Jason hadn't expected to see again so soon. General Black entered the cafe, his bearing immediately commanding attention and respect from everyone present. Behind him was Colonel Harper Hunter, the decorated officer from the previous evening, and two men in dark suits who were clearly military intelligence rather than corporate security. Boone's face went pale as he recognized the general, and his companions immediately shifted from aggressive posturing to damage control mode. The arrival of senior military leadership suggested that the situation had escalated far beyond a simple confrontation between a veteran and a defense contractor. "Mr. Boone," General Black said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I believe we need to have a conversation." "General, you were just threatening a decorated combat veteran and attempting to intimidate a journalist investigating corruption in defense procurement," Colonel Hunter interrupted. her tone making it clear that she had been briefed. On the situation, would you like to explain why civilian contractors believe they have the authority to threaten military personnel? Jason realized that their conversation was being monitored, not by Boone's people, but by military intelligence. The implications were staggering. His confrontation at the gala had triggered a much larger investigation, and he had unknowingly become a key witness in what appeared to be a major corruption probe. One of the military intelligence officers stepped forward and addressed Boone directly. "Sir, we're going to need you and your associates to come with us for questioning regarding irregularities in defense contract oversight." The transformation of the situation was swift and decisive. Boone, who had entered the cafe believing himself to be in control, now found himself facing federal investigation by people with real authority. His corporate security specialists, trained to intimidate civilians, were helpless against military personnel operating with official backing. "This is harassment," Boone protested weakly. "I haven't been charged with anything." "No, sir, you haven't," Colonel Hunter replied, "but several equipment failures linked to your company have resulted in American casualties, and we have reason to believe that quality control protocols were deliberately falsified. We need to discuss those matters in a more formal setting." As the military personnel escorted Boone and his associates from the cafe, General Black approached Jason's table. His expression was serious but respectful, acknowledging both Jason's service record and his current circumstances. "Son, I apologize for the disruption to your reunion," he said, glancing at Arya with obvious appreciation for her protective instincts. "But I'm afraid your confrontation last night opened a door we've been trying to get through for months." Jason felt the weight of realization settling over him. This investigation was already ongoing. "For 8 months, Colonel Hunter confirmed. We suspected systematic corruption in defense procurement, but we needed someone with credibility and specific knowledge to come forward. Your service record and direct experience with equipment failures made you an ideal witness, but we couldn't approach you directly without compromising the investigation." Aurora was furiously taking notes, recognizing that she was witnessing the unfolding of a major story. "So the gala last night wasn't coincidental." General Black's smile was slight but telling. "Let's just say we made sure certain people would be in attendance when Mr. Statham received his invitation." The manipulation was subtle but effective. Jason had been maneuvered into a position where his natural integrity would force him to confront corruption, providing the military with the catalyst they needed to move against the conspiracy. But Jason wasn't angry about being used. He was impressed by the sophistication of the operation and relieved that his instincts about the scope of the corruption had been correct. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we need your formal testimony about equipment failures you personally witnessed," Colonel Hunter explained. "And we need Ms. Griffin's research to provide the broader context that connects individual incidents to systematic corruption." Jason looked down at Arya, who had finally relaxed her protective stance now that the immediate threats had been neutralized. Her presence had been crucial, not just for his emotional healing, but for providing the courage he needed to face the larger implications of what he had uncovered. "There's something else," General Black said, his tone becoming more personal. "The investigation has revealed that the explosion that separated you and Arya wasn't random. Intelligence suggests it was specifically targeted based on information that could only have come from someone with access to classified operational details." The implications hit Jason like a physical blow. The attack that had nearly killed them both and led to 3 years of grief and guilt hadn't been the random violence of war. It had been a deliberate attempt to eliminate someone who knew too much about equipment failures that were costing lives. "Someone tried to kill us to cover up the corruption?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. "We believe so," Colonel Hunter confirmed. "And now that you've publicly confronted one of the key figures, you and Arya are potentially in even greater danger." Jason felt Arya press closer to his leg. Her instincts detecting the elevated stress in his voice and posture. The reunion he had thought would mark the end of their ordeal was actually the beginning of an even more dangerous phase. But this time, they would face it together, and this time they knew who their real enemies were. The journey of self-discovery and redemption that had begun with Arya's miraculous survival was evolving into something larger, a mission to ensure that the corruption responsible for so many unnecessary deaths would finally be exposed and punished. Jason had spent 3 years believing he had failed his partner. Now he understood that their greatest test still lay ahead. As they prepared to leave the cafe under military escort, Jason realized that the peaceful life he had imagined rebuilding with Arya was impossible as long as the people responsible for their suffering remained in power. The only path to true redemption lay through confronting the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed them both, regardless of the personal cost. The war was far from over. It had simply moved to a different battlefield with higher stakes and more dangerous enemies. But this time, Jason and Arya would not be fighting alone.